Hello, I am Kimmy with On William Street, and we are here to help you become a more confident quilter, from the piecing to the quilting and everything in between. So this week, we are going to show you how to make continuous bias tape. So now don't forget, everything that we're going to talk about today, all the steps and everything are going to be included in our blog post. So we'll link that below in the description. So you can always head over there and check it out and see all the instructions written out. Also, don't forget to check out our shop where we have all sorts of fun, modern quilting patterns ready for your next project. So first off, why would we want to make bias tape? When we talk about binding our quilts, normally we'll just cut the fabric on the straight of grain. We know most of our quilts are square, and it's not a big deal to cut them that way. And so that's how we do most of them. But every once in a while, we'll have a project where we really want to have that bias. And there can be a couple of reasons for this. One is maybe you want the fabric direction to go a different way. We have this nice fun stripe that we're going to use, and we want the stripe to be angled in our binding. So that's why we're going to be doing our bias binding today. Another reason that you would maybe want bias binding is if you have any sort of curves in your outside of your quilt. Sometimes with your quilt, you'll have a curved edge or curved corners, and having a bias binding makes it really, really easy to stretch and maneuver that binding around those curves. So it makes it, like I said, real simple to do those curved curves, whereas if you're trying to do it with a straight of grain, it might not lay quite as flat and quite as nice. So those are a couple of reasons that you might want to do a bias binding. But don't be intimidated. Bias bindings are quick and easy. And I have this really fun, easy method that I'm going to show you. And it's going to give you one nice, long, continuous bias binding when we're all done. So with bias binding, as opposed to just cutting strips the width of the fabric from selvage to selvage, we're actually going to start out with a square. And I do have a square here. I know it's kind of hard to see because it doesn't all fit in the frame, but I do have a square here. And the size of the square that you cut is going to determine the length of the binding. So if you need less binding, it's going to be a smaller square. You need more binding, you're going to need a bigger square. So if you want to kind of see our chart and the numbers that we come up with, for the binding, you can head to the blog post and it's going to have the different sizes of squares and approximately how many inches of binding you're going to get out of each of those squares. So you can check that out. We've done the math for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Then what you're going to do is I've jumped ahead a step just for space constraints. You're going to cut that in half from corner to corner on the diagonal. So I have two nice big triangles here ready to sew together. And what this does is this goes ahead and gives me my bias edge. If you're not sure what a bias edge is, it's simply a cut that is 45 degrees compared to the edge, compared to the selvage of your quilt. And the reason that we have that bias, or we work with that bias sometimes, is we have a lot of stretch and give. So that's what's going to allow you to bend and maneuver it around things, whereas there's not nearly as much stretch here on the straight of grain on these sides. So this one you're going to be able to maneuver and twist that really nicely and really easily. So now that we have it cut in half, we're going to make a giant parallelogram. So I'm going to try to see if I can show you. So I've got one point going that direction, and I'm going to take this half, whoops, right sides together, and I'm going to angle it the opposite way. So I've got long end here, point with both of my 45-degree angles going down the middle. And this is a spot where you can definitely match patterns if you want to. I'm going to line up my stripes and I'm going to match them up and pin them together so that when I do have it finish it all up, it looks like one big continuous piece of fabric. So I'm just going to take one moment here, line all of these up, and then we're going to sew them together. And we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam all the way along the top. So then I'm going to take it to my ironing board and press that seam. And I'm just going to go ahead and press it open for this. So now that it's all ironed, we're ready to draw some lines. With this, these are going to be on the back of the fabric. So you could use a fabric marking pen if you wanted to. I'm just going to go ahead and use a pencil because you're never going to see these. These are actually going to end up being our cut lines. So this is where you're going to determine how wide you want your bias strips to be. We like to do our binding. We cut ours at 2.5 inch wide strips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start right here on the edge, and I'm going to draw a line at that 2.5 inches all the way along that biased edge. So we want to make sure that we're going along our angled edge when we're doing this. And I'm going to maneuver things around a little bit to make it fit on my sewing table here. So just go ahead and draw that line all the way down. Then, when you've got that line drawn, you're just going to draw another one, 2 1/4 inches from that line. And just repeat this all the way across your entire fabric. All right, so now that I'm all done with that, I do have this little bit of extra here that doesn't fit into a 2 1/4 inch, and that's perfectly fine. We'll just go ahead and be cutting that off later. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to fold it into a nice little tube. But what we're going to do is we aren't going to line, that's my extra one, we're not going to line these up straight. We want to offset it by 1. So I'm going to come over here to where I have my full strip, and I'm going to line this up so that I'm offsetting it so I have 1 full strip before I start sewing together. One thing to keep in mind when you're lining these up is I'm going to go ahead and line it up along this like leftover where I've got my seam. So my line is basically going along the edge there because you're going to have your 1/4 inch seam. And so that's going to come down about my 1/4 inch. So you can see, like I said, where I've got this ironed open, this angle here on my underneath seam is where I'm lining my angle up on my drawn line here on top. And so that's just going to help me make sure that they're offset just a little bit because they're going to come together here on about the 1/4 inch in where I sew. And that's where I want them to come together. I don't want them to match necessarily along the top here. Now that we've got that sewn, I have a nice big tube you can see here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to go ahead first. I'm going to press this seam open as well. So one thing to keep in mind is I have this little bit of extra section here. This is the one that wasn't quite wide enough. So go ahead and put an X, mark that off somewhere so that you know to stop on that line. You don't need to sew all the way across there. We want this whole strip to be free just like we have a strip at the beginning that's free. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cut on that line we drew. So first I'm going to start by cutting off this extra strip that doesn't work. Now this is one because we have a tube where you do have to just take your time and use your scissors. It doesn't work with a rotary cutter very well because you don't want to accidentally cut things that you shouldn't. Just about around to where my actual bias strip is going to start. Remember, this is just cutting off the extra little bit that we didn't use. So this I'm going to get rid of. Now all I have to do to finish out my bias tape is to just continue cutting on this line, and it's just going to go around and around and spiral around until we get to the other end. And now I have one big, nice, long strip of bias tape all ready to fold in half and put on my quilt and get it all finished. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And don't forget, all of the information we talked about today, all the steps, everything we went through is in a blog post. Plus, we also have starting sizes so that you have an idea of about how many inches you're going to get out of one specific square of fabric. It is going to depend a little bit on the width of your fabric, of your bias strip. We do ours at 2 1/4 inches, so that's what we'll base them off, but it will give you a nice starting point. We always recommend planning a little bit of extra binding so you don't get to the end and run out before you're done. And when you are done checking out the bias strip measurements, don't forget to head to our shop and check out all of our fun modern quilting patterns. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll see you next week.